The night air tasted like old iron and coal smoke. I woke to the thud of a train that felt more like a hand on my shoulder than a sound, a heavy, steady presence that had outlived everyone I loved. My pickup's heater had died hours ago. Snow had powdered the canvas tarp over my bed. I blinked against it, fingers numb, and for a quiet second the world was nothing but the cold and the rails humming under some distant freight. Before we continue, make sure to hit the like button. Also, tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are right now and which city are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. I don't know why I remember the exact smell of the rails. Maybe because I helped lay them once, every nail driven by hands that knew how to hold steady under pressure. Maybe that's why the sound of trains still steadies me in a way nothing else can. Tonight the train passed and left a hollow in the air, and when it did, I thought about the old plaque at the first bridge I'd ever built. Small bronze letters hammered in with a young man's pride. They'd once said my name there. Now it felt like someone had rubbed the letters smooth. I pulled the collar of my jacket tighter and tried to count the streetlights like an old man counting sheep. I fell back asleep between numbers. I woke again to a boot on the tailgate and a voice that wasn't the wind. "Sir? You okay?" It was young. Too young. A voice full of heat and concrete dust. I rolled over and there was a kid standing there with a hard hat tucked under his arm and a flashlight carving his face out of the dark. He squinted at me like I was a ghost. "You're the man from the plaque, aren't you? Rowan. Henry Rowan." He said my name with the kind of certainty that makes you wonder if you once meant more than you remember. I tried to make a joke. It died in my throat. The kid climbed down, boots crunching over the gravel as if he weren't afraid of stepping on someone older than him. He smelled like coffee and diesel. "Come on, you can't sleep out here, you'll freeze." I wanted to say I was fine, that I had eaten worse, that I preferred the cinder beds to company. Instead, the words that came were small and true. "I'm not lost," I told him. I'm waiting." He didn't press. He only looked. "Name's Caleb," he offered. "I work on the new spur. My granddad used to point at that plaque in town and tell stories about the man who built the old line. There's a particular kind of grief that tastes like metal in your mouth. Mine was bitter and familiar, not the quick, hot kind that hollows you out the day somebody dies, but the slow, grinding rust of being reduced to a memory. 2 winters ago, I had a house with a stove that hummed and a nameplate on the mailbox. I had a wife who could coax a laugh out of me even on bad days, and I had a son I trusted to keep the ledger straight. I sold the farmland to pay for my wife's treatments. We thought it would buy time. Instead, it bought a ticket to nowhere. The sale went through, the checks cleared, and then my son started talking about investments and liquidity and streamlining operations. He smiled while he said it. I signed the papers because I believed him the way you believe your child when they offer you their hand. That was my mistake. Caleb handed me a paper towel and a paper cup of something that tasted like brown sugar and warmth. He had wrapped it in his own gloved hands as if offering someone a medal. I drank it like a blessing. "What happened?" he asked, as if the answer could be summed up and thrown away. I didn't answer right away. The truth had become a long, thin wound that I kept covering with different bandages. "They said I was careless," I told him finally. "They said I was tired and forgetful. A doctor signed a thing. A judge signed another. My son took my cards and made them his. My wife—" I stopped, saying her name would tear loose everything I'd sewn up. "She's gone," I told him. It was enough. He didn't ask for details. Nobody does. They only listen until the part where they have to act. Caleb squinted at me like he was checking me for a pulse more than a story. "You should come to the depot," he said. "There's an old clipping in the office archives. Folks there keep things for a long time. Maybe there's something. He said it casual, like a suggestion to get a sandwich. But there was heat in his jaw, a combative, honest sort of loyalty that makes young men dangerous in the best way. For reasons I couldn't name, I let him help me pack the truck. He folded the tarp with the kind of respect you give a flag and tossed a blanket over it like it was a second skin. He drove like he was worried we'd be late for something important. Maybe we were. Maybe the important thing was that I let a hand on my elbow that belonged to somebody not of my family. The depot smelled like old varnish and cold coffee. Paper clips rattled in a rusty jar on the clerk's desk, and sunlight cut the dust into strips that looked like bars. Caleb moved like a kid in a library, a respectful intruder, and when he came back he had an old newspaper folded twice. The headline was faded to the color of bone. Local engineer reopens Valley Line. The photograph beside it showed a much younger version of the man in the plaque, shoulders wide under a wool coat, eyes flat with the belief that he could move mountains with a level and a crowbar. I held the clipping with hands that trembled not from age, but from a sudden, sharp recognition. The engineer in the photo had my hands. Not all hands are the same. Mine had the calluses of a man who'd spent his life under steel. "You sure that's—" Caleb started. I set the paper down, tracing a thumb over the grain of the photograph like a man polishing a metal. "I built that line," I said. Saying it aloud felt like returning a name to a lost dog. "I designed the spur, the cutoff under the hill. We were meant to keep it in the family." The words fell into the dust and made a small cloud. Caleb didn't ask why it wasn't. He only looked at me with the kind of fierce, open curiosity that has undone smarter men than me. "Then we'll find what's left of it," he said simply. "You tell me where to start." I thought about telling him to go home, to take his hard hat and his clean shirt and his future, and leave the past to rot where it lay. Instead, I felt a small, unfamiliar hawk of something stir inside me. Not pride, not exactly, but a tether pulled taut. "Start at the old siding," I said. "Walk down past the mill pond. There's a plug in the map nobody ever saw. If the deeds still mean anything, that map still means something." Caleb grinned like I'd given him a secret to treasure. He put the clipping in his jacket and stood up. He moved like he believed in possibilities. It's dangerous to meet people who still believe in things. They make you believe again whether you want to or not. That night I slept in the cab of my truck with the engine purring low and the clipping on the dash like a small flapping flag. The rails sang out the same song, only different now. Not a dirge, but a thread being stitched back through something that had been ripped. I woke to a cold so fine it could cut paper, and the thought of walking down to the siding felt less like punishment and more like a plan. Caleb knocked on the window, flashlight in hand, and for the first time in a long time I answered. The boy waited. I got out. We started walking. We walked the thin path along the ballast like two thieves moving through a sleeping city. One of us with the memory, the other with the knees to climb and the light to see. The mill pond sat black to our left, its surface a sheet of iron reflecting nothing but the moon and the ragged clouds. Frost crisped at the reeds. My breath made brief ghosts that dissolved before they could be named. Caleb kept his boots soft on the ties like a kid who'd been taught to respect the rails as if they were a church. He moved with an impatient kind of reverence that made me forgive him for his youth. "You ever walk this siding when it was full?" he asked me without turning, as if expecting the answer to be obvious. I wanted to say yes, and not because it was true in the way he meant. I wanted to say yes because I had been the man who measured the grades, who bent the steel to the land, who knew where the water liked to creep and where frost would lift the ties in the spring. "Every track tells you a story," I said instead, because that was the closest honest thing I could offer. Caleb laughed low, the sound quick and surprised. We reached the stretch where the map in my head started to make sense. An old switch hidden by blackberry and thyme, a faded concrete marker with moss eating away at its edges. Knelt and brushed my gloved hand across the stone. The indent was still there where an iron spike had pulled loose decades ago, the ghost of the bolt that once held the siding's signal. The place smelled like wet earth and oil and the small comfort of things that endure. This is where years ago I stood with a draft in my hands and a cigar in my teeth and told the foreman we could make the grade. We dug a foundation in winter when men said we were fools, and the ballast settled like blood into the bones of the hill. I had thought then that to lay down steel was a kind of immortality. You build a line and future people ride it, and you are remembered in the cold letters of a plaque. That was before the papers and the signatures and the quiet predations of people with satin smiles. We found the old service hatch where my plans had tucked themselves away under a slab. The hatch was stubborn with rust, but it gave with a groan that sounded like an old man rising from a chair. Inside was the stale air of an unopened book. I lit a small headlamp and crawled in. The tunnel smelled of limestone and old ink. There on the shelf was a rolled blueprint tied with a string so brittle it disintegrated when I touched it. My handwriting on the corner, angular and certain, the lines of the spur drawn in a hand that had once been steady. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The paper was proof in the most basic, tactile way. The thing existed. I rubbed the pencil marks between my thumb and forefinger like a carpenter checking the grain of fine wood. Caleb sat at the tunnel mouth and watched me like he watched every old gesture, as if I were a relic he'd been taught to respect. "You planning on suing someone?" he asked, half joking, half curious. He was young enough to think law was a quick fix, to believe in a subpoena like it was a key in a lock. "Not yet," I said. The word carried the weight of a man who'd been burned by the machinery of courtrooms already. I remembered the first time their smiles had tipped. It was a kitchen table lit by a cheap lamp, my wife folding the napkins the way she always did, smoothing creases as if they could be ironed out of life. We'd celebrated a small victory that week, a good bid on a line of ties, a contractor who'd stayed honest. My son had called from the city that night, his voice full of numbers and futures. I'd listened to him like a father does to a child recite a poem. "We can put the proceeds in a bridge fund," he said. "It will preserve the land and still pay the bills." My wife smiled at me, a small, sad smile with more trust than sense. "I signed the papers because I trusted my family the way you trust a boat to stay afloat. There was an art to how people steal from you when you love them. It is not the clumsy grabbing of a thief in a mask. It is the gentle reordering of life into transactions until you no longer recognize where your things end and their plans begin. First, it was rearrangements, accounts consolidated for efficiency, a new signature line added to a form because we need speed. Then came the doctor's note, perfunctory and beautifully phrased, concerns raised, cognitive lapses, recommendations for oversight. The words were clinical, but the teeth behind them were sharp. The judge signed the paper like a man stamping a pass into a museum exhibit, and in the space between the stamp and the seal, my house became a thing they could auction. When the conservatorship hit the docket, it felt like a winter storm visited me in private. My son's face at the hearing had been calm and practiced as a man reading his lines. My wife looked like someone in pain who'd been taught to look sorrowful on cue. My daughter cried in the way actresses cry. The right pitch, the proper quiet sobs. Outside the courtroom, neighbors shook their heads the way people shake snow off their coats, perfunctory gestures of pity that never disturbed their day. I left the building with a legal notice in my pocket and a thin allowance stapled to my dignity. Inside the tunnel, the blueprint smelled of that other life, of hands that had been used to measure twice and cut once. I could still see the ledger inked in the margins of my memory, numbers that had been moved by fingers that trusted themselves above my name. The sale had been legal on paper because the right documents had been filed with the timestamp and the shiny seals. But legality dances on the edge of moral truth sometimes, and our family had learned those steps better than I had. "Did you ever talk to him?" Caleb asked softly, meaning my son. I pressed the rolled plan to my chest like a relic. The silk of the paper scraped my skin. "I tried," I said. "I tried to be practical. I was a fool who thought the truth of work. Building, measuring, planning would be enough against suits and ledgers. The truth is, when you hand a young man the controls of something he can sell and convert into a number, you are asking him to choose." My son chose himself. We sat in the belly of that tunnel and watched the light edges of the world creep slowly into the mouth. Outside, the town was waking into a day that might not care whether I existed. But something else was happening then that I hadn't expected. The blueprint remade me. It organized the fragments in my mind into plans, not pleas. The thought of calling a lawyer felt less like humiliating myself and more like finally putting a lock on a door someone had left open. It was small. It was tactical. It was the first useful thing I'd felt in 2 years. In the years since the conservatorship, I'd perfected the way to appear gone while still listening. You learn to sit where you cannot be seen, but you can see. You read the obituaries when you can, and the meeting minutes when you can beg a favor in a library. I'd stayed alive on small kindnesses, a bowl of soup from a church, a place to sleep under a borrowed name at a shelter when the weather turned cruel. But the blueprint changed the arithmetic of shame. Proof turned things into facts. Facts can be argued about in court, yes, but they also move crowds and make papers sit up straight. Caleb's breath was a warm rhythm in the cold as he shifted beside me. "So what now?" he asked, the question both immediate and enormous. I rolled the blueprint open on my knees, the lines of the spur unfurling like a map of a country I thought I'd lost. "Now we start at the records office," I said, steady as a man who had worked with levels and bullets all his life. "We find the deed. We follow the chain. If the signatures are what they claim, then we'll have to make it clear that law means something even to those who think themselves above it." My voice did not tremble. Inside it, something that had been hungry for a long time finally felt fed. Caleb smiled, teeth bright in the headlamp glow. He reminded me then with the bluntness of the young that I had been a man once who could bend the world with a wrench and a plan. There was no promise of victory in his grin, only the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, the tracks led back to more than memories. The next morning smelled of wet paper and diesel. Caleb picked me up before sunrise, headlights cutting a thin tunnel through the fog that clung to the valley. We didn't talk much. Men rarely do when a day already has its own purpose. The blueprint lay between us on the seat, rolled tight inside a plastic sleeve like evidence. Every few miles, the truck hit a seam in the road and the tube rattled against the dashboard, a heartbeat reminding me that the past was still alive and noisy. We drove to the county recorder's building, a brick box from the 50s that looked like it had been built for filing and forgetting. Inside, the air smelled of toner and wax. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of gray cabinets, the kind of light that makes even living skin look like paperwork. A woman at the counter looked up from her screen with the dull expression of someone who had seen every variety of lost cause. I could tell what she saw when she looked at me. An old man with a borrowed jacket and a young companion pretending to be his social worker. "Morning," Caleb said with his easy confidence. "We're looking for land records tied to an old rail spur off the valley line. Might be under a private deed from the 70s or 80s. The woman pushed her glasses up. You have a parcel number? Not yet, I said. But I have a name that should be on the surveyor's notes. Rowan. Henry J. Rowan. The name felt strange in my mouth, like something borrowed from a time when signatures mattered. She frowned and typed. The keys clacked, the database wheezed, and then her eyebrows lifted a little. You said Henry J. Rowan? We have a microfilm reel with that name on a property survey from '79. Industrial zoning. Unincorporated land. You'll have to check the archives downstairs. Downstairs was another century. Metal shelves lined with boxes, dust so thick you could draw maps in it. Caleb rolled the microfilm reader toward me like a relic, flipped the switch, and a white circle of light burned the dark away. The screen blinked and lines appeared. Topographic contours, handwritten notes, and finally my own name at the bottom corner. It was a survey for the Spur, filed but never formally processed. The attached deed listed the owner as H.J. Rowan Holdings, LLC, a small limited liability company registered under a P.O. box I had once used to keep side projects separate from the corporate ledgers of the main firm. Looks legit, Caleb said, squinting at the grainy print. So it's yours. Was, I corrected him. Or might still be if no one ever dissolved the company. The next step was the Secretary of State's office downtown, a place of marble floors and cold echo. We sat in a line of people clutching folders, each face lit by the same fluorescent despair. When our number flashed, I explained what I was looking for. A corporation that might have died decades ago but hadn't been properly buried. The clerk disappeared into the back and returned with a manila envelope, a faint film of dust along the top. Inactive but not dissolved, she said. No final filings, no transfer of assets. Technically, it still exists. Technically. A word sharp enough to cut through 2 lost years. Caleb grinned. So legally, that patch of land is still yours. I nodded slowly, the shape of the possibility settling into place. If the taxes were paid, I said. The clerk looked again at her screen. Property taxes for that parcel were absorbed under a new holding company in 2015. Name of record. She turned the monitor toward me. Rowan Development Group. For a moment, the letters swam. My son had used my own name to swallow the ghost of the company I'd built. It was the kind of irony that bureaucrats find tidy and fathers find poisonous. Caleb saw my hands tighten on the counter. We can trace the filings, he said quickly. See who signed them. We spent the rest of the day at a long oak table in the reading room, the kind of place where light fell in hard angles and time moved at half speed. Each folder told a piece of the story, notarized pages, transfers, electronic records printed for storage. The first signature on the 2015 document was unmistakable. Ryan Rowan, CEO. I stared at the slanted R that used to look like mine. Below it, a second signature, Catherine Rowan, executor, my wife. The ink was crisp, black, deliberate, 2 ghosts bound together by a pen. Caleb broke the silence. You could take this to court, right? Fraud, misappropriation, something. I shook my head. They had power of attorney. They used it cleanly enough to look legal. Paper trails make good. Camouflage. I traced the date with my finger. June 12th, the week before my hospital stay. They had timed it perfectly, waiting until I was under sedation for a minor surgery to file the transfer. It wasn't until the 3rd folder that we found the first crack. An internal memo from the accounting firm mentioned an unverified title overlap between Rowan Development Group and H.J. Rowan Holdings, LLC. The accountant had flagged it, requested clarification, and then stamped it resolved with no attached correspondence. That's our thread, Caleb said, excitement breaking through his professional tone. If that overlap was never cleared, you've got standing to challenge every transaction built on top of it. I looked at him, surprised by his fluency in legal language. He shrugged. My mom's a paralegal. I've seen paperwork ruin better men. We photocopied everything, the clerk charged by the page. Each sheet slid from the machine like a receipt from fate. I folded them carefully into a new envelope. My hands didn't shake this time. Outside, the sky had turned the color of metal. We sat on the courthouse steps eating sandwiches Caleb bought from a cart. People streamed past without noticing the old man with grease on his coat and the kid with dirt under his nails. It felt like a conspiracy of two against a world that had already written me off. You think your son knew what this would do to you? Caleb asked quietly. He knew exactly, I said. He just didn't care. To him, the company was a machine to be optimized. I was the rust. I looked down at the documents, but he forgot who built the engine. We drove back to the valley with the heater humming. The snow had turned to rain. Thin, icy needles that streaked the windshield and turned the tracks slick. I told Caleb about the early days, sleeping in survey tents, marking the first grades with stakes and string, the sound of sledgehammers ringing like church bells at dawn. Building rail was always about persistence. You swing, you miss, you adjust, you swing again. Paperwork, I was learning, demanded the same rhythm. When we reached the siding, the fog had swallowed the hills. We set up in the cab of the truck with a portable lamp and spread the documents across the dashboard. Each page was a coordinate, each signature a nail in the coffin they'd tried to build for me. Caleb made notes on a yellow pad, connecting dates and companies, drawing arrows the way engineers draw stress lines. It felt strangely familiar. The same methodical satisfaction of drafting a bridge, only this time the structure was built from evidence instead of steel. By midnight, the plan was clear. The old corporation still existed. The new one sat illegally on top of it. If I could reactivate the dormant entity, even temporarily, I could file an injunction preventing any further development on that stretch of track. The valley line would grind to a halt until the courts decided who owned what. It wasn't revenge, it was leverage. Engineers understand leverage. Caleb leaned back, exhausted but smiling. You're going to make them notice you again. I don't need their notice, I said. I need their acknowledgement. Outside, another freight train passed, its horn cutting through the rain like a verdict. The wheels shrieked against the curve I had calculated 40 years ago, still perfect, still holding. The sound faded into distance, leaving only the ticking of the cooling engine and the whisper of rain on steel. For the first time in years, I felt like I was back on level ground, cold, wet, but balanced. Tomorrow we would file the paperwork. Tonight I allowed myself a small, private smile. I wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. I was following tracks. By dawn, the rain had frozen into a thin crust that made the rails glint like knives. Caleb slept in the truck's passenger seat, head against the window, mouth open just enough to make a small fog bloom on the glass. I sat awake, watching the sky trade its color from coal to pewter. The blueprint lay on the dashboard, anchored by a half-empty thermos. The pages curled from damp. Every so often I'd reach out and smooth them flat, not because they needed it, but because I did. We'd spent most of the night drawing a plan, each line precise, each move deliberate. Not revenge, not yet, but a structure to hold the anger until it could become something useful. At 72, fury is a poor tool unless you know how to aim it. Caleb stirred when the sun broke the horizon. You ever sleep? He mumbled. I'll sleep when they remember my name, I said. The county courthouse opened at 8. We were waiting when the clerk unlocked the door. Inside, the heating system thumped to life like an old heart. The same woman from yesterday looked up, startled to see me again so soon. Back already? She asked. Just tying loose ends, I said. I need a certified copy of the dormant company's registration and the memo on that title overlap. She hesitated. That memo wasn't supposed to leave the records department. I'm not asking to take it, I said. Just a certified transcript. I want it to exist in daylight. Her eyes flicked to Caleb, then back to me. Maybe she saw something in my face. Not desperation, but the steadiness of a man who's decided that truth is worth the paperwork. She printed the forms, stamped them with the county seal, and slid them across the counter. You didn't get these from me, she said quietly. By noon, we were in the city, standing in front of a building made of glass and self-importance. Rowan Development Group, spelled in brushed steel letters 6 feet high. I had designed bridges cheaper than that lobby sign. Caleb parked down the block. You sure about this? I'm not here for a fight, I said. I'm here for a reminder. The receptionist was young, efficient, and just polite enough to make you feel small. Do you have an appointment, sir? No, I said, but tell your CEO his father's here. The sentence landed in the room like a dropped wrench. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or call security. I handed her a sealed envelope, the certified documents we'd spent the morning collecting. Give him this, I said. Tell him I'd like it back signed, if he still remembers how to sign his own name. Then I turned and walked out before the cameras could remember me. The wind hit like applause. Caleb caught up halfway down the block. What did you just do? Delivered history, I said. The kind that can't be shredded. We spent the afternoon in the public library using their computers to trace the company's expansion. The numbers painted a familiar picture. Acquisitions, shell transfers, quiet renamings. My son had built his empire with the precision of a surgeon and the morality of a loan shark. But one set of filings froze me in my seat. The new freight terminal, the one he'd been celebrating in the papers. The address matched the coordinates from my old blueprint. The line I had designed to test locomotives had been reborn as the crown jewel of his portfolio. That's your land, Caleb said, leaning over my shoulder. It was, I whispered. But here's the part he doesn't know. I zoomed in on the digital survey overlay. The new terminal sat neatly on the registered parcel, but half of its foundation extended beyond, into the unrecorded strip of property tied to my dormant company. The hidden siding, my forgotten tunnel, a 5-acre oversight buried under concrete and arrogance. Caleb whistled low. So technically, half his flagship project is sitting on your ground. Technically, I said, and that word again felt like a key turning in an old lock. And if I reactivate the company, I can file an encroachment claim. He won't be able to operate a single train until the courts sort ownership. Every shipment, every contract, frozen. Caleb leaned back, a grin spreading. You could bring the whole operation to a halt. I could remind him what happens when you build on someone else's foundation without checking the blueprints. That night we drove to the valley. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, the place where my life had split in two. The new freight terminal glowed against the dark like a monument to theft. Tall floodlights cast the yard in a sterile brilliance. Trucks moved like ants. Cranes lifted containers that clanked like cash registers. The company name, my name, stretched across the side of the main building in enormous letters. Rowan Logistics Center. Caleb killed the headlights, and we sat in silence. From this distance, the place looked almost holy, like a cathedral built from steel and profit. I remembered the first survey there, the way my wife had brought coffee in a thermos and watched from the truck while I hammered stakes into the frost. She'd said the land felt alive, the ground humming under our boots with the promise of progress. Now it was paved and numbered, its pulse buried beneath asphalt. Caleb pointed to a section near the east end. That's where the tunnel would be, right? I nodded. Under those cranes. If the map's right, they built straight over it. We watched as workers moved crates marked with the company's logo. Each one might as well have been stamped with my initials. I felt anger rise like steam, but it wasn't the wild kind anymore. It was cold, measured like pressure building in a sealed tank. Engineers know pressure isn't the enemy. It's potential waiting for direction. Why not go public? Caleb asked. You've got documents, proof. The press loves a story like this. Because stories end, I said. I'm not after a headline. I want permanence. I turned to look at him. When this is over, I don't just want them exposed. I want the record to show what they took, every inch, every dollar, every lie. And I want that record to carry my name again. We drove back in silence. The fog had thickened, wrapping the world in gray cloth. At the edge of town, I told Caleb to pull over by an old diner that hadn't changed since the 80s. We took a booth in the corner, the kind that creaked under honest weight. I laid the certified documents on the table between the salt shaker and the sugar packets. Tomorrow, I said, we file to reactivate H.J. Rowan Holdings. Once that's done, I'll have legal standing to challenge the encroachment. But we'll need help. A lawyer who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Know anyone? Not anymore, I said. But I know where the sharks swim. I spent that night in the truck again, the paperwork folded neatly in my coat pocket. Sleep came in fragments, flashes of blueprints, of courtrooms, of my wife's hands smoothing napkins that would never wrinkle again. I woke before dawn to the sound of another freight train rolling through the valley, the horn long and mournful. When it passed, I whispered to the empty air, "You built it on my ground, son, and the ground remembers." The next day we drive into Austin and find the shark, the kind of lawyer who eats corruption for breakfast. But for now I watched the rails glint under the first light and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but purpose, sharp and clean as new steel. The courthouse coffee tasted like burnt wire, but it was hot, and that was enough. Caleb sat beside me, hunched over the same yellow pad he'd carried since the start, scribbling the final checklist before we walked into the attorney's office. The pages looked like the underside of a bridge, calculations, arrows, notes about leverage and load. The boy had learned my way of thinking. Build everything twice, once in your head and once in the world. The lawyer's name was Michael J. Ortega, a man whose reputation carried the weight of a locomotive and the charm of a switchblade. He had the eyes of someone who read contracts for blood rather than ink. His office smelled of leather and ambition. "You want to wake a dead corporation," he said after I'd finished explaining. "That's unusual but not impossible, especially if that corpse still owns property someone's using without title clearance." He flipped through the documents with surgical precision. "These filings are clean. Your son's company absorbed assets that weren't legally transferred because the original LLC never dissolved. That gives you standing to file an encroachment claim and an emergency injunction." He looked up. "You'll need to make noise, though. They'll ignore you until you threaten their investors." Caleb leaned forward. "What kind of noise?" "The kind that echoes," Ortega said. "Public exposure, press coverage. You show up at their ribbon cutting, you put the truth on record where cameras can see it. It won't win you a case overnight, but it'll freeze their confidence long enough to buy leverage." He handed me a form and a pen. "Sign here to re-register your company as active." My hand hovered over the line. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Maybe because this wasn't about money anymore. It was about taking back a name. I signed slowly, each letter deliberate, the ink pooling at the tail of the N. When it was done, Ortega slid the paper into a folder. "Congratulations, Mr. Rowan," he said. "Your company just came back from the dead." The ribbon-cutting ceremony was 3 days later. I hadn't planned to attend. I had intended to let Ortega's filings speak for themselves. But then a local reporter ran a story about Rowan Development's legacy of innovation, complete with a photo of my son smiling under the headline. It used words like visionary and self-made. That was enough. Caleb drove us to the terminal at noon. The lot was crowded with dignitaries, investors, and the kind of people who smile for cameras but never for each other. I stood near the back, invisible under the brim of my cap. The sun caught the chrome of the freight cranes, turning everything too bright to look at. Banners hung from the building, my name blown up 10 feet tall, attached to a man who'd buried me. A string quartet played. My son stood at the podium, tall and polished, his suit the color of wet steel. He spoke about growth, family values, and the future. Each word landed like grit in a wound. When he said the word legacy, I felt Caleb's hand tighten on my arm. Then came the cue. Cameras shifting, the ceremonial scissors poised to cut the ribbon. That was my moment. I stepped forward. The crowd murmured, confusion rippling through their neat rows of expectation. My son hesitated, mid-sentence, eyes narrowing as he recognized me. For a heartbeat, the microphone caught only silence. That electric pause when the past walks into the present wearing a face you hoped was gone. I walked up the steps, slow but steady. My boots echoed. "You're standing on my ground," I said loud enough for the microphone to catch, and not just metaphorically. Gasps, cameras flashing, the whisper of reporters smelling blood. My son tried to recover. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a tight smile, "this is my father, he's—" "The engineer who designed the Valley Line," I interrupted. "The man whose name you painted over. The land beneath your new terminal still belongs to H.J. Rowan Holdings, registered and active as of this week." I reached into my coat and pulled out the certified documents, holding them up so the cameras could see the county seal gleaming in the sun. "You built your empire on my foundation," I said. "And that foundation is about to be repossessed." He stepped forward, whispering through clenched teeth. "What are you doing?" "What you taught me," I said, "using leverage." The press surged closer. Reporters shouted questions. Ortega appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression a quiet smirk. Caleb lifted his phone, recording every second. My son's PR team tried to usher people away, but the cameras followed me as I handed the envelope to Ortega. "This man represents the rightful owner of the land beneath this terminal," I said. "We'll let the courts decide who really carries the Rowan name." It should have felt like victory, but as I looked at my son's face, red, trembling with fury and fear, what I felt was exhaustion. This wasn't triumph. It was excavation, digging up the bones of something that should have been left in peace. The ceremony ended in chaos. Investors muttered. The quartet stopped mid-song. A reporter shouted my name. Caleb guided me back through the crowd, steady as a rail under pressure. When we reached the truck, I sat for a long moment, watching security usher my son away from the microphones. He didn't look back. Caleb exhaled, grinning. "You just burned his empire to the ground in front of everyone." "No," I said softly. "I just showed them where the cracks were. Gravity will do the rest." We drove in silence for a while, the valley sliding past in shades of winter gray. My hands rested on the blueprint spread across my lap, its corners frayed from too much use. "You know," I said, "when I built that first line, I thought I was building something permanent. Steel, stone, concrete. I thought they'd outlast us all." "They did," Caleb said. "You're still here. He's the one who's temporary. I looked out the window at the tracks running parallel to the highway. The train that passed us then was long and loud, its cars marked with rust and history. I wondered if the engineer inside had any idea whose hands had once drawn the curves beneath his wheels. That evening I sat in the motel room with the TV on low volume. The local news ran the footage from the ribbon cutting. My son's voice cracked on live television. My words played clean over the anchor's commentary. The rightful owner of the land beneath this terminal. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. But fame was never the goal. The real victory was smaller, quieter. A notarized motion on Ortega's desk, stamped and filed, freezing the company's operations until the matter of ownership could be resolved. For the next 90 days, nothing would move in that terminal without my consent. Caleb came in from a call and tossed a newspaper onto the bed. The headline read, "Engineer Reclaims Legacy. Rowan Development Faces Legal Storm." I stared at it until the letters blurred. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Caleb said. I nodded. "It feels right." But right doesn't erase what's gone. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Some things can't be replaced. A home, a woman's laughter in a kitchen, a son's faith. But dignity, that can be rebuilt, rivet by rivet. As night fell, the valley outside was alive with wind and the distant echo of train horns. Each sound rolled through me like a heartbeat I'd thought I'd lost. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and statements. But tonight, the only court that mattered was the one inside my chest. And for once, the verdict was clear. I hadn't won yet. But I'd stopped losing. The night after the confrontation, I couldn't sleep. Victory, it turns out, is a poor substitute for peace. My body sat still in the motel bed, but my mind kept walking, back down the line through the valley to the place where the rails used to hum with life. Every creak of the walls, every groan of the wind outside sounded like an invitation to finish what I'd started. By 3 a.m, I gave up pretending. I dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and drove toward the freight terminal. The highway was empty except for the occasional truck grinding through the fog. The world felt like a film left running after the story had ended. Gray, echoing, full of ghosts that hadn't gotten the message. When I reached the edge of the property, the security lights were still blazing. The terminal sat behind a chain-link fence, proud and empty now that operations had been frozen by court order. The cranes were still, their arms reaching into nothing. I parked on the service road and killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost holy. I slipped through a gap in the fence that someone had cut years ago. Maybe vagrants, maybe time. The gravel crunched under my boots. My breath fogged the beam of my flashlight. I followed the contour of the hill until I found it. The place where the ground dipped unnaturally, where a concrete hatch was half swallowed by weeds and mud. The tunnel. My tunnel. I knelt, brushing away dirt until the steel handle appeared. It was rusted, stubborn, but it moved. The door gave with a low groan that sounded like memory itself complaining about being disturbed. I crouched and slipped inside. The air was stale but dry. My flashlight caught the ribs of the old retaining wall, each stone marked with the chisel strokes of younger hands. My hands 4 decades ago. I walked slowly, trailing my fingers along the damp concrete. The sound of the world above faded until there was only the soft drip of condensation and the dull rhythm of my heartbeat. I designed this place as a testing tunnel, a small spur where engines could idle without blocking the main line. No one had used it since the project ended. Now it felt like a time capsule sealed just for me. Halfway in, the beam of my flashlight caught something metallic wedged behind a support beam. A small iron box, about the size of a shoebox, its surface furred with rust. I set the light down and pulled at it. The box came free with a shudder and a small rain of dust. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside were paper envelopes wrapped in oilcloth, a few old photographs, and one folded document sealed with wax. The wax had cracked, but the paper inside was still dry. I unfolded it carefully. It was a property title, the original deed for the land beneath the valley line, signed by me and countersigned by my wife. At the bottom was a second page, one I didn't recognize at first. A letter in her handwriting. Henry, it read, "If you're reading this, it means time has done what we always feared. Taken memory before it took the man. I had the lawyer draw up this transfer in your name alone. I know you'd never think to protect yourself first, so I did it for you. If our boys ever lose their way, this paper will remind them who gave them the ground they stand on. Love, always." The letters blurred as the tears came before I could stop them. Her handwriting was round and certain. A teacher's hand, not an engineer's. I could almost hear her voice, that patient steadiness that had anchored me through every storm. I sat on the cold floor, the letter shaking in my hands, and the full weight of the years settled on me. Every compromise, every signature I'd trusted, every silence I'd mistaken for peace. She'd known what might come. She'd known our son's hunger long before I did, and she'd left me the one thing he couldn't fake. Proof written in love, not greed. Beside the deed was a small photograph, edges curled from age. It showed her standing in front of the first bridge I ever built, snow falling around her, that half smile she wore when she thought I wasn't looking. Behind her, barely visible, was the same plaque Caleb had pointed out the night we met. My name shining then, untarnished. I don't know how long I sat there. The flashlight began to dim, its battery giving out, the beam shrinking to a halo. In that shrinking light, I realized how close I'd come to letting them bury me alive under paperwork and shame. But she hadn't let me. Even gone, she'd built one last foundation. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it inside my jacket. The box was heavier now, though its weight hadn't changed. Just the meaning. I stood and walked deeper into the tunnel, to the sealed end where the concrete wall met bedrock. I ran my hand over the surface. The wall was solid, but it vibrated faintly with the echo of the trains above. The sound of a legacy that refused to die. I whispered to her then, to the woman whose absence still filled every room. "You were right. The ground remembers." The words came out rough but steady. As I turned back toward the entrance, my flashlight flickered and died. For a moment I stood in total darkness, the kind of dark that's not empty but full, thick with memory. I could hear my own breathing, the faint drip of water, the hum of distant rails. Then I laughed quietly. Even blind, I could still find my way. I had built this tunnel. Every curve, every echo was mine. When I emerged, dawn was crawling over the hills. The light hit the valley in long bands, painting the cranes and containers in gold. The world above didn't know what had changed. Not yet. But I did. In my pocket lay proof that could unmake an empire and restore a name. Caleb was waiting by the truck, half asleep behind the wheel. When he saw me, he sat up straight. "You went down there, didn't you?" I nodded, handing him the box. "Found what we needed." He opened it, staring at the papers. "Is that—" "It's everything," I said. "The original deed, her letter, my signature before they tried to erase it. It's the story they hoped would stay buried." He whistled softly. "You realize this changes everything, right?" "I do," I said. "And that's why we'll handle it carefully. No headlines this time. We'll let the law do its work. Quiet justice." He smiled. "You think that's possible?" I looked out across the valley, the morning mist rising off the tracks like breath. I built a railroad through a mountain, son. Anything's possible with the right tools. We drove back in silence, the box between us like a heartbeat. The sun climbed higher, turning the frost on the rails into steam. I thought of my wife's letter, of her faith that love could outlast deceit. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe legacy wasn't about plaques or buildings or corporate empires. Maybe it was just about leaving behind something that told the truth. By the time we reached town, I could feel the exhaustion settling deep in my bones, but it wasn't the old hollow kind. This was the kind that follows a day's honest work. The good fatigue of a man who's built something with his hands and knows it will stand. When we stopped at a red light, a freight train crossed in front of us. The cars clattered past, one after another, and for the first time in years I didn't look away. Each wheel struck the rail like punctuation. Steady, certain, a sentence still being written. A month passed before the case closed. In the end, it didn't end in drama. No gavel slam, no shouting in courtrooms, no cameras outside the courthouse. Just a thin envelope in the mail, official seal, 3 lines of text, and a judgment that restored ownership of the Valley Spur to H.J. Rowan Holdings, LLC. It was quiet justice, the kind that doesn't make headlines but rearranges the world all the same. The court acknowledged the original deed, the signatures, the letter from my wife that proved intent. Rowan Development Group was ordered to vacate and reconstruct its boundaries. The terminal shut down within a week. My son settled privately soon after. Lawyers talking to lawyers, paper to paper, without a single apology exchanged. I didn't need one. Apologies are currency in a world I no longer trade in. The day the ruling arrived, I drove back to the valley alone. Snow still crusted the edges of the rails, the air crisp enough to taste. The cranes were gone, the lights off, the vast yard silent except for the wind brushing against the fencing. It looked smaller without the noise. I parked where the siding curved toward the tunnel and got out. The ground felt solid again. My ground, the way it had when we first built it. I walked slowly down the line, each step deliberate, feeling the gravel shift under my boots. The plaque from the old bridge had been missing for years, but in my pocket was something better. A new one, freshly engraved, sent by the County Historical Society after they'd read the court decision. Henry J. Rowan, engineer, builder of the Valley Line, 1979. Simple words, true words. That was enough. I knelt at the base of the bridge and bolted it in place. My hands were slower than they used to be, but still sure. Each turn of the wrench was a memory. Of early mornings, of laughter rising over the sound of engines, of my wife bringing me coffee in a chipped blue mug. When the final bolt tightened, I sat back on my heels and looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, sunlight spilling through in thin gold ribbons. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was rebuilding something lost. I was simply returning something to where it belonged. Caleb arrived a few minutes later, walking down the tracks with a grin and a newspaper tucked under his arm. "You beat me here," he said. "Old habits," I told him. "You start your day with the rails or they start without you." He handed me the paper. The headline was small but kind. "Local engineer recognized for historic restoration." No mention of scandal, no mention of the sun, just a story about a man and his work. That was the way it should be. "Looks like you got your name back," Caleb said. "I never lost it," I said quietly. "Just had to dig it out from under the wreckage." We stood together in silence for a while, watching a freight train snake along the horizon. The cars shimmered in the sunlight, each one a moving reflection. Caleb looked at me sideways. "So what now?" "Now?" I smiled. "Now I build again. Maybe not tracks, maybe stories. Maybe teach a kid what a blueprint really means, not lines and math, but promises made to the future." He nodded, the grin softening into respect. "You're a hard man to forget, Henry." "Good," I said, "and because the world forgets too easily." Later, I drove into town, parked near the old depot, and walked inside. They'd turned it into a small railway museum. Brass fixtures, polished floors, sanded to a shine. A few school children were there on a field trip, their voices bouncing against the high ceiling like birds. I leaned against a display case and listened as the guide told them about the Valley Line, about how it had connected towns, carried goods, built communities. When she mentioned my name, the kids turned to look at the photograph on the wall, the same one Caleb had shown me months ago, the younger man in the wool coat, the engineer who thought steel could outlast sorrow. I looked at that version of myself and smiled. He was still in there somewhere, older now, slower but unbroken. The guide noticed me lingering and came over. "You look familiar," she said. "I should," I said. "I built the thing." She blinked, then laughed softly. "Well then, you've aged well." "I've been weathered," I said. "There's a difference." Outside, the afternoon stretched warm and long. I sat on a bench near the tracks as the sun dipped low, turning everything the color of brass. A local commuter train rolled in. Newer model, smoother lines, but the same rhythm in its wheels. The conductor waved. I waved back. As the train pulled away, the air filled with that old, comforting thunder. The rails sang under the weight, and for a moment it was as if all of it, the betrayal, the courtrooms, the loneliness, had been nothing but the climb toward this sound, this steady human pulse that had followed me all my life. I closed my eyes and let it roll through me, the vibration humming deep in my bones. When it faded, I felt the stillness settle like dust after a storm. You spend your life building things you think will last forever. Bridges, families, names carved into plaques. And maybe none of it lasts the way you imagined. But sometimes, if you're lucky, the work outlives the pain. As I got up to leave, I looked down the track, stretching into the distance. Two lines vanishing toward the horizon, steady and parallel. The sound of another train came faintly through the wind, far away but certain, proof that the line still ran. I walked back to my truck, the sun warming my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. I was home, not in a house or a deed or a courtroom, but in the rhythm of the rails themselves. And when I drove away, the plaque gleamed behind me, catching the last of the light. A small, silent reminder that a man's name, once earned, doesn't need to be shouted to be remembered. It just needs to endure. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit the like button. It really helps more people find our stories. And tell me in the comments, what part hit you hardest? Was it the betrayal, the redemption, or that quiet peace at the end? I read every comment myself, and I'd love to hear where this story met you tonight. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, some tracks never end. They just keep running beneath our feet.